Well, good afternoon, shipmates, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you out back on the ship after a beautiful day in Haines, I hope. And it's one of my friends there said summer has finally arrived with a day like today. But as I told you, there's an old saying in this rainy part of the world that when the sun first comes out in the summer, the dogs bark at it to scare it away. But Alaska is a fantastic, great land with many a surprise. And even if you've been here many times, even if you're a resident, you're always in a sort of a sense of wonder and discovery of something. And I hope you've discovered something new today or something you never imagined or had seen before. My surprise was that I was invited for lunch with a couple of council members of the local Tlingit Chilkoot nation here. They're based in Haines, and they told me they just bought the old U.S. Army base parade grounds. They built a clan house, and now they're going to open it up as a cultural center. So here's a U.S. Army base that has been returned to the natives, and they said, when you come back, when we're ready, we're going to invite the people from the ship for a salmon feast in their clan house. So I'll make a reservation for you. But that's the evolution of Alaska. It's just sort of had so many people come and discover it and settle, and busts and booms and all kinds of dramatic history. And now the indigenous native people have more agency and economic resources and are proudly in charge of their own land, in this case, right in the center of Haines. But I'm going to show you sort of a quick history of all the different explorers and the different people that have come, some well-known, some anonymous, who have made Alaska what it is today, and they're still finding more of it. This was a picture my friend Paul took just the other day of the peak of Mount Perouse, named after the French explorer who came here. And that's up near Latuya Bay, but we saw all those fantastic mountains coming in. I'd never seen such clear weather, looking like a great Himalayan range right all across the sea. But the first people who came to see this place, of course, came from over in Asia by all current research. Still a matter of DNA analysis and things, but there was what they call Beringia, the great land bridge during the last ice age. And so it's thought they either came overland or else they came by canoe and boats, voyaging down the coast and settling island after island. And that may be how they got all the way, the different native peoples got all the way down to South America. But this land bridge is now shallow sea, the Bering Sea, and then the Chukchi Sea on the north side of it. It's only 100 or 200 meters deep at its deepest. So it was once like this. The mountain range went all the way over. This is 20,000 years ago, counting down to the present. You can see that the mountains have been rising, but the sea has been encroaching, making the bays and the islands to the point when the Bering Strait was opened about 8,000 years ago. So they date the human contact here to the period when people could actually walk over here. And they think they actually came over, and it was just part of the great Siberian landmass. So they were mostly hunters after mammoth. And they could cross over. You can see the outline of, here's the Seward Peninsula now, and we're down here. But there was so much more land, and it was just big open tundra, most of it. And so the first people came over maybe 20,000 years ago. There may have been some go back, and this is where there's a lot of mitochondrial DNA analysis of the haplogroups, whatever they call it. All those are listed down there, because you can identify way back into prehistory with this technique. And you see they got all the way down to Monteverde on the coast of Chile at 15,000 years ago. Well, this was their reason for migrating. The great mammoths would come across, and the humans would chase them, and they had techniques to spear or drive them over cliffs, and they have pits where they have the remains, bones, and tusks all through Siberia into North America. And the study of those bones, which are in great heaps, is an indication of how people followed the herds. And when that herd was gone, then they would migrate and go find another one. So they think that if they were not sea people in the canoe travel, they actually came across the land bridge because there was an ice-free corridor that went right into central North America, where the Folsom and the Clovis tips, spears, and bones have been found as the first earliest archaeological site until they found other ones even older of all places in South America. Well, we're going to Wrangell, which was again settled by these people probably from boats, and on the beach outside to the west of where we will land in Wrangell, there are these big slabs of slate with petroglyphs all over. There are hundreds of them way down the beach, and so this is now a preserved state park where it is considered these are the incisions of the first people who arrived. They may have been done, I don't know, 100 years, 1,000 years, give or take or so, but the local people don't do this anymore. But the images that they carve back that far, it's hard to say with the stone, are the same things that are being woven and painted and all used as the native iconographic imagery, this being an orca. There are others that are more curious, spirals or like her mazes. This looks like some of those Celtic mazes, and there are petroglyphs like this in many parts of the world that indicate a kind of a prehistoric consciousness and ability that was the stage of human thought, that carving something in a stone was a great achievement, perhaps, just because there was no iron and it was all stone on stone. But this is the ovoid eye, which they paint on many things, and you see it all over the native crafts. It's said to be either a sea creature's eyes underwater, or when you just look in the water, you see your reflection. The movement of the water will change the look of your round eye into this sort of thing. So that's a typical motif here. Here's another one that's a face of, we just don't know. It could be a spirit or it could be a self-portrait. Well, these are the sort of things that indicate the range and the activity of all the people. But when it comes down all these thousands of years, you have these very distinct groups in the different parts of Alaska, from the Aleutian Islands to the Alaska Range down to the southeast coast where we are now, much less in the far north. So these are the first discoverers. These were the founding peoples of this great part of the world. And now we know them in mostly their group names because they'll have distinctive languages that are dialects of a route that is now not necessarily known. This is up and down Nootka, that's Georgia Strait, Vancouver, BC, Washington. And if you're in Oregon, you even have the same culture along the coast. And we have been up north here, and now are north of Haida. We're in the Tlingit land, and up the Lynn Canal, and then it goes on where we started in Seward. But these people were remarkably adapted to the environment, first of all, by having sturdy craft. They could paddle around, go fishing, go traveling. Some of them were big war canoes, and they'd had occasional battles up and down for the islands. But mostly they were the daily use, sort of like people would have a horse or you have a car now. You would always have a dugout canoe, a cedar carved out, one that you'd make in your village, and then you could go out fishing or gathering. Here are Nootka people again. It's just an example of how elaborate their culture became, because life was pretty easy here. In this part of Alaska, it didn't snow or freeze at sea level. There was always shellfish out on the low tide. You could always catch fish at different kinds of through the year, and then you could go gathering in the woods, and there were all kinds of edibles, if you know what they are. And so it developed a kind of a settled and elaborated culture. They were not nomads. They were not being chased by tigers or anything like that. So from the coast to the mountain, there developed these trade items, mainly fish that would go up dried up into the upland, trade with the interior peoples. Shellfish would go making baskets. They'd get mountain goat hair from the highlands and weave it, and then they'd sell the coats back. That's a chilkat blanket. You've seen some of these in the shops. They're still making much of this today. And other whale oil, meats and different things. So it had they were instinctively mercantile in the sense that they traded items regularly. And it is said that perhaps people here would go far down the coast, farther than we could imagine going. Somebody told me that there was a certain shell that they prize in the shell work here that only comes from Monterey, California. So somehow they took a boat all the way down there, or else they did it by walking, or it was a trade item. These things like obsidian and other special items that are made in one place get found in all kinds of other places because of the extensive trade routes. Well, of course, Asia and Europe are well known for that, but this is also in North America. Along the coast here, one of the main items they would trade was this ulihan, they call it, kind of a sardine that's very rich in oil, and if you dry it and then press the oil out, it is considered like an olive oil that you cook with. It has a lot of vitamin A, vitamin D, and they would put the oil in a skin container in a wooden backpack, and they would hike up over the mountains and take it in hundreds of miles into the interior and trade it for other items. And then other images of at the first contact here with a ceremonial canoe going by. Again, they would go to neighboring islands or areas. They have a big potlatch where they would trade things and they'd dance and they'd tell the stories. They had no writing or paper or wheel or iron, so this was a oral culture and a Stone Age culture in a sense, but they still built wonderful boats and made very elaborate arts and crafts. This is at a museum, and you may have seen this in Juneau, where they make ceremonial paddles, which they will present as gifts. This is not what they're out there paddling with, now that they have Yamaha motors. But when the first contacts came, they saw these tremendous big boats that were carved out of a single cedar tree. And they started doing it in different places. Wrangell, where we're going, they're carving a new boat out near the marina. But there was also competition. So here's a war club indicative of certain groups would raid on others, and they were not very kind to each other. They would enslave people, and there was a high and a low class system among most of the people in this part of Alaska. But when you go further out to the Aleutian Islands, the Alutiiq, and out further, the population is very sparse. The islands are rocky. If you're not able to handle getting your food from the sea, there's no agriculture. There may be a few berries and things, but these are those islands on the tip of the Alaskan Peninsula, they call it, to the west of Anchorage, and then going out to the islands. And so when the first Europeans came here, they were amazed that these people could live at all on these barren rocks where it's cold as can be and snowed in all winter also. But these people probably came from Siberia and then developed the skills to build kayaks. And this is the critical advantage of these people, are these nimble boats that are now famous around the world. Everybody wants to go kayaking. But they were a very sturdy people. When the Russians first came here, they were very impressed by their elaborate weavings and adapted clothing, especially this visor. It sort of looks like a golf cap, but it was elaborately decorated with walrus whiskers and beads and different things. Now you see them in the museums. And they would use fur. For instance, this is from a polar bear that's used as a dance decoration by these people. And then even more remarkable are the Inuit, who come in many different groups, from the Yupik, the Umiak, and different. There's all kinds of names. This is actually in their own pronunciation of their area. So there's only maybe 100,000 people in northern Alaska and northern Canada in different territories, but they somehow have been there for 10,000 or more years, surviving in this incredibly harsh condition. And again, they adapted their life to somehow live there, and they feel comfortable. These are drawings of them with the walrus ivory lamprey, which was considered a mark of status. And then they would live in, depending on where they are, if they had wood, often this is actually made out of whale bones, these sort of tents with hides that were the first image of how they lived. The igloo they would only build when they're out hunting on the ice, but when they're on a firm ground, they build villages like this. So these are images from the past, though they're starting to tattoo and pierce themselves again because it's back in fashion, right? But you can see these kind of hard-baked Inuit who went with Peary's voyage to the North Pole. And of course, a lot of these people were never named, and we don't know who they were or where they're from, but without them, the various other explorers never would have gotten halfway there. And again, they have these tremendously well-built kayaks with this one happens to be made out of wood. Sometimes they're made just out of bone. But when the other people came here, they realized the value of these boats. And here's a kind of an image of a Bidarka where a guy has a gun. So the Russians in particular impressed the local Alouette and Alitik people to go out and hunt. They made them have a quota, or else they would burn down their village and things like that, or kill them for not providing enough fur. And this was the intrusion of the Russian era, where what's called the prospektinivi would be the fur trappers and the traders that would just go out on their own and particularly go for the fur. And I showed the other day that an otter fur, the finest fur of any animal, a piece of a meter or so would be worth $5,000 of the time, and was the most expensive item in trade from this whole area. I mean, beavers were caught to send to Europe. These otters, sea otters, were the reason why the Russians came over. They were already crossing Siberia, and the Trans-Siberian exploration started by Peter the Great. And so they came to the peninsula of Kamchatka, which is off the shore of mainland Siberia, which is a very forbidding place, sort of like its equivalent across the Pacific in Alaska, with high mountain ranges by the sea, volcanoes that are still active. There's some 60 active volcanoes on Kamchatka Peninsula. And so it's almost impossible to get over that. They went by sea and came up from Oskos and then settled into Petropavlovsk to make a fur trading center. And that city is still there. It's the large Russian naval base now. We used to go on this ship and stop there every time we would transfer the ship from Japan and Asia over to Alaska. I think we're going past it this time. But that's a very Russian city with its cathedral and industrial base and shipworks and all this. And it's set on the Avacha Bay, which is a beautiful natural harbor with volcanoes over it, and the town is somewhere over on the flanks there. But it's a very secure base to go out from, because big storms in the Pacific, you often don't have that kind of shelter. So they thought, they knew that they'd heard that there was land to the east. This is the Bering Strait with the Diomede Islands in the middle. And so the Russian explorers, with native help, came up here, and they kept poking, and they realized they'd have to get a bigger vessel to cross over and see what is over on what is now the Alaskan side. So here's a Russian-produced map which shows all that they knew about Siberia, but then the big blank of North America kind of called to them. And when they had word and samples of the fur, they engaged a Danish ship captain, Vitus Bering, who was working for the Russian Navy at the time, to build ships and go on an expedition to find out what was over on the other side. Now, this was only in 1741 and 42. So you think, well, that's kind of late, but this was back in an area where this whole area was very much unknown to the rest of the world in Europe. So he built the St. Peter and St. Paul, which were open boats of about 35 feet each with a pickup sprit sail. So this is pretty small vessels for crossing. And they went all through the Aleutian Islands and came all the way back over a year. And this particular book is the detail you can't see, but it shows them sort of getting kicked around by storms, and they crash onto one island after the other. They see, the first sighting of Alaska was near Mount St. Elias, where we passed from Seward, and then one of the boats came down down to this area and came in around Sitka, and then they both separated, and one boat was crashed on the Komandorsky Island, and Bering himself died. There was only a handful of the 60 that set out that made it back to even tell the tale. And so you can imagine how tough that was in the rough waters over the winter, above all. I mean, we have pleasant weather now, so it's pretty easy, but you can imagine being out on open boats sort of looking for things. And the Russians sent more expeditions, and many were lost in the storms because they really didn't know quite where the island and the coast was, and by the time you find out, it's usually too late. So there's a great loss of life trying to find out where to go and how to chart it and be safe. And the Russians led the way at this particular time, but what they were after was the fur seals and the otters, which they ruthlessly exterminated to the point where they were almost extinct by the end of the 1800s. And it was a US-Russian treaty, 1911, which made environmental protection for these seals on Pribilof Island. That was an example of how conservation has been going back that far for fear of extinction. On Bering's journey, he had a German naturalist named George Steller, who was very well trained in his Linnaean style botany and other ornithology, and so he was the first one to write descriptions of some of the unusual wildlife, this being the most famous, the Steller's jay, which is a bright blue bird that flies around. You can see them all around here. Also the Steller's eider, like a duck. And he described the great sea cows up here, which is sort of a manatee or a dugong. There are many varieties, but this one was immense, like a whale. And sure enough, it was hunted out within 50 years. And then he also described things we still don't know what they are. He described a sea monkey. He wrote in Latin, so everything had to be translated sort of to whatever language. But people have been looking for this thing ever since. It's just imaginary, we think, and it was probably because they saw young otters or fur seals bobbing in the waves and they had had too much to drink or whatever, and they thought it was a monkey of all things. Well, anyway, that expedition set the stage for the rest of the world to come in. And Bering himself died, froze to death on his own boat, and was buried on this island at the end of the Aleutians. And since then, he's been credited as one of the great explorers of the time, even though this was his only expedition. But especially in Russia and in Denmark, they are proud of him. There's actually no good picture of him, but there are a few monuments in Denmark and in Petropavlovsk, where he set out from. And I found a couple of stamps in his honor. So this is where the Russians still feel that this is their part of the world. And of course, I mentioned that there are some that want to get Alaska back, and some argument about it. But that's a long time ago, and I don't think it'll happen. But meanwhile, the name goes on Bering, and this is the new icebreaker up here, the Vitus Bering. And so his legacy goes on. Of course, others came and followed, famously Captain Cook, who in 1890, on his third voyage, brought his two ships, the Discovery and the Resolution, all the way around from England down back to Tahiti, and then he tried to get up to find the north-east-west passage, the Straits of Annan, they used to call it. Now it's called the Bering Sea, because he thought he would eventually find the way over, making him a triumph, except that he came here to Nootka Island on Vancouver Island. Then he went up and he couldn't get through the ice. He came back to Hawaii. His ship was in such bad condition. He put in for repairs, and then he had his fateful killing on the beaches of the big island of Hawaii. But he did come and annotate, and his scientific team described, and they charted out waters, especially as you go into, this is Nootka Bay, which was the one place that was settled on Vancouver Island then. So here it is today. It's a very, again, like other bays that are broad and deep, they provide shelter. And so this already had a community, but the Spanish had come up here, and now Cook came here and described, so this was the matter of some contention that almost led to some fighting over it, because the Spanish built a little fort, and then they were helped by the local people. Sometimes you'll read the local people say, well, we helped all these foreigners move to Alaska, and in this case BC, and what did they do? They immediately started fighting amongst each other. So they didn't quite understand the mentality of some of the outside forces. In this case, Makila and his son are making the agreement that allowed the Spanish to build the fort that was the first land settlement for the Spanish this far north. Of course, at that time, Spain went all the way down to Argentina, so it was a very large force that decided they would settle up here, Quadra. Then he sent Malaspina up here, 1790, again, the same time that Cook was up here. The Malaspina strip took them all around South America and up to, again, to Nootka, and further explorations along the coast. And they set up this Fort San Miguel. And it didn't last very long. It was all built out of wooden palisades, and in the climate here, it's not like building a big stone castle, so there's only a bare remains of it now. But that was the most northern of the Spanish settlements in North America, beyond all the other ones we may have heard. But a lot of places still have Spanish names, all the way up to Valdez, where we were, is, of course, Spanish name. And then Malaspina himself leaves his name on the largest ice field in this part of Alaska, and you may remember we were right there in Yakutuk Bay to see the Hubbard Glacier. Well, this contention for the area led the Spanish, the British, and then the Russians were at a kind of a standoff, but there were very few forces. This was at the end of the world. Back in the capital cities, this was considered, other than the fur trade, there's no reason to send colonists up here, because there was no agriculture. They weren't going to fight over all these islands that didn't have much use of it. But the Russians put their new archangel, they called it, capital in Sitka, where we will be tomorrow. And this is the flag of the Russian-American Company, which was chartered by the government in St. Petersburg to conduct and manage the trade, like the Hudson Bay Company and others that had a monopoly in the area, and then they had to establish relations with the natives and figure it out, and then hopefully make it all worthwhile. The fur trade boomed, and then it collapsed because they overhunted it. But this is the center, the capital of American Russia, Sitka, which still has you can go tomorrow to see the cathedral, and we'll be docked, or rather anchored over here, and there's a very generous harbor that's very well protected, but not far from the broader ocean. This was Alexander Baranov, who was the governor, director of the company and governor of Russian America for many decades, and also made peace with the local Tlingit people who they rebelled at a point against the decimation of their fur stocks and their demands of the Russian government. And they had a brief war in 1805. The Russian Navy came in and bombarded the villages of the Tlingit people in Sitka. But you can go see the battle site and a historical display about this all of tomorrow. Meanwhile, the British sent up George Vancouver, who had been an aide to Cook, and he was an excellent navigator, and went and did methodical soundings and cartography all through this area. And of course, the great city of Vancouver was named after him. Here he is on the City Hall today. And then he went back to England. He was buried in England. This is where he lies today. But others came. For instance, Comte de la Pérouse, the French captain, led an expedition. The competitiveness of the Europeans was impressive. So here's Louis XV or someone getting the map to charter the expedition that came all the way from France via Tahiti and the south. And they came the first time anybody had been to Lituya Bay, which is near Yucatan where we are. But when they were trying to sound out the entrances and chart the bay, riptides and a storm came and overturned 2 of their boats and drowned 21 of their sailors. So this is the drama of exploration and discovery. And again, the local people were generally welcoming and tried to be cooperative, but it was, this transition of Alaska just is unrelenting. One thing is good one time and then others come along. That was the waterfront wrangle. And so a lot of the native people became guides, hunters. This is an interior Athabascan guide. And then they had other help. This woman, Kate Cormack, which is her English name, she had a Tlingit name, and she was from Skagway originally, and she lived in a shack with her husband, Jim Snookum. But they were the ones that were out hunting over the hill, and they found the first gold that started the gold rush. And it's said that while she was cooking dinner in the camp, the couple of men were out hunting, and then she went to the stream to wash something and found it was full of gold. And they credited her with the woman who led to the great Klondike gold rush. Unfortunately, women, especially Native women, were not allowed to file a claim. So she put it in the name of her husband, and then she died poor because he ran off with somebody else, something like, or he took a hike like all these miners. Anyway, it was a rough and ready world out there, but she's now remembered as the starter of this particular area of Alaskan history. And then the coastal and some of the interior Yukon especially got filled with prospectors and hunters, and again, cooperating with the local people. These are some very large sea otter pelts and some even bigger bear pelts. And so this was a pretty wild land if you were in the hunting kind of a way. This was the way they killed the seals in the old days. They herd them up and then they just pound them to death and skin them and put the pelts on. And others just go up for the big elk. And a lot of it is now off limits. The hunting seasons are very restricted, and the local people, either they are hunter or they often object to it, particularly people from the outside coming and hunting. And so everybody coming to Alaska sort of had to find out the hard way how big this land is, how much trouble it is, how much it costs to this day. It's almost twice as expensive in many ordinary things than other parts of the United States. And then it became of some military importance. This was the first U.S. Army surveyor that came up to try to find places to build trails so that if need be, they could get through with any military. But it's mostly unruly frontier towns, miners, the fishing canneries. Particularly the Yukon developed a kind of a river trade, so a lot of people came up by boat from the Bering Sea all the way up the Yukon to the Dawson and the gold fields. Others came up from mostly Vancouver and Seattle area to come up for the fishing season, which is still the case. But the more they tried to get into the interior, the more found it was difficult. And this picture I found is of they laid a railroad for the Alaska Railroad, and then the ground froze and heaved, and their whole work was completely bent up by the winter, which is still a problem, but they have better techniques now. This is a gentleman, Reverend Shelton Jackson, who was a Presbyterian minister to the Tlingit people. And tomorrow in Sitka, you can go to his museum, which is a great collection of the early arts and crafts of the Tlingit people. He himself dressed sort of locally. But the great writer that came up that you keep hearing about was John Muir, the Scotsman, who lived in California. He was essential in convincing Teddy Roosevelt and others that they should save Yosemite and establish national parks. And so if you can see his book, his passage to Alaska, it writes very poetically about all this here. And then others came. This is another U.S. Army official, Billy Mitchell, who was famous for starting the Air Corps, as they called it. But his first time to Alaska, he was given assistance to go find the route to put the first telegraphs from Vancouver, actually, all the way up so they could have telecommunications. Well, you can imagine if you were a native Alaskan, this history is pretty tumultuous, and again, I say they are very good-natured for all the troubles that have been caused by other discoverers of this great land. So nowadays you have tourism as the current boom, and which is a lot less damaging than some of the other extractive industries. But now you can come up and get a indigenous kayak. Well, now it's made out of fiberglass. And then you can go off. Again, you're going to find your own discovery almost every day if you just go outside of where you are and start paddling or climbing. And so you have to be prepared. And you can go in the interior and get a dog team and relive the Iditarod. I'm going to read that's the dog race from Seward to Nome. Originally a desperate attempt to take some medicines to the city of Nome at the time, and so the dogs made it all the way. Now they have it as a race, so if you like your huskies and such, and you can do this, it's the Olympics of the North here. And so there's a song that goes, I won't sing it, but way up in Alaska, the state that stands alone, there's a dog race run from Anchorage to Nome. It's a grueling race at a lightning pace when the chilly wind do blow beneath the northern light across the snow and ice, and it's called the Iditarod Trail. And a lot of people compete in it now. Sometimes people take it easy, though, and they just take a skidoo, or they take the skidoo, but they bring their pet along. I mean, this is extreme winter sports, and the people here are, let's say, used to this long winters, and they go out and enjoy it, but many people come up to do things, and they're just not prepared, or they're not, above all, they go out on their own, and so here's a typical sign that travel not recommended, and above all, tell someone where you are going, because every year people just come up to Alaska, go hiking, and they discovered something, but they never came back, let's say. Well, here's a guy who found something. I don't know if that's whether he caught that moose or whether he is a moose. Well, anyway, I'm going to show you just a bit of the current life. Here's a local folk singer. I believe he was playing in the Red Onion in Juneau last night, or it's a look-alike contest, but he's called Hobo Jim, and he's a sort of a Bob Dylan songster for Alaska. And he has a song, I guess you'll have to look him up for the real plucking tune, but it goes, "There's a part of me wild and free. In my heart there's a wild wolf howling through the tall pine tree. It's a long, cold trail that I've been on. It just doesn't seem to be the end to this way I've been going. I can see the road spreading over the land. I see a young boy standing with a suitcase in his hand. It was long ago that boy was me. I was running like a wolf in the mountain, wild and free. I got in my mind that it must have been the times that made me want to wander away from a family that I love and a warm roof above, but everybody else around me just say, it's just me being wild and free." Well, that's what people sometimes want more than they should, including, I don't understand this, more Polynesian culture coming to Alaska. I mean, how cold can surfing be? Well, curiously, today, this Hawaiian voyaging canoe has come from Hawaii, actually brought up by Alaskan barges and then reassembled, and they're in Huna with their Hawaiian crew, and they are planning to sail through this area with no engine and do a 3-year journey around the Pacific, going all the way down California, Mexico, South America, across to Polynesia, over to New Zealand, back up to Japan, and then back to Hawaii. And this is one of their great proofs that the Polynesian navigation, and particularly these sturdy canoes, could manage the ocean and do transoceanic trade. And they are being sponsored by the local Tlingit Nation, and they are out there in their bigger local canoes to greet the Hokulea, which in Hawaiian means the Big Dipper star constellation. But this is an example of perhaps there were explorers, discoverers between Hawaii, Polynesia, and Alaska. And there are myths that say people came, and there has been some transmigration in modern centuries. But this is a big news for the local people that they have a kind of a representative of the nation of Hawaii, being the indigenous people of Hawaii, come there to go sailing around. Now, this is a kind of tough waters for that kind of a boat, because you have no below deck. You have to sleep on deck. They're in flip-flops and swimming suits, after all. They're coming up here. Well, they're being greeted by this kind of a canoe, the Tlingit ceremonial war canoe. And I just had lunch with elder council member of the Chilkoot Tlingit Nation here, who is going off to the point to see the Hokulea come by with their local canoes on their way to Juneau. Then on June 10th, they begin their trans-Pacific journey. Well, that's an example of modern discovery. And even if the land is remarkably the same as it was when the first people saw it, this is a arch on an Aleutian island, which was sighted by Bering, Vitus Bering on his trip. And a local sculptor built a version of it that's in Vancouver's Stanley Park. So this kind of a discovery exploration goes on. Alaska's so big and there's so many parts to it that if you want to know more, you can go to this nonprofit organization which assists people to know about things, or else go hiking, and they organize expeditions on their own. So this great place, you can come many, many times, and there's always more to see. And if you have the energy to go out. So we just saw this. This again, Yakutak Bay and the Hubbard Glacier. So you've had your little taste of what these original discoverers saw, and can appreciate the awe that this land makes. Someone once wrote that once you've been to Alaska, every place seems somehow not so big anymore. And I'll leave you one last view. That's Mount St. Elias that we took the other day. And one last saying of T.S. Eliot: only those who risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. And with that, I wish you a great adventure of discovery in Alaska. Thank you. Thank you.